You know, it doesn't matter if it's a sponsor or a random person. Every now and then someone says something that just sends my BS meter into I don't know why it's Morse code, but that basically translates into we're gonna test that. So
The Kraken series AIOs from NZXT come in many shapes and sizes to fit your CPU needs. The Kraken Elite series RGB coolers feature a 2.36-inch 640 by 640 customizable LCD screen, showing system info or custom images and GIFs for a custom look, F-series RGB fans, and a single breakout cable for simplified installation. If low-key is more your thing, the Kraken Elite series also comes in a black non-RGB edition while retaining the amazing pump screen. To see the full lineup of new Kraken Elite and non-Elite coolers from NZXT, follow the link in the description below.
Okay, so we got a few things going on here. If you guys don't recall, this Origin PC is the one I recently did a review on to kind of I wanted to do some temperature testing and stuff on it. And in that video, I said that all the fans set to exhaust is suboptimal. And I really pushed that fact, and we had a call after about my findings. And that's one of the things I do like about Origin PC is when we find something we feel like can be improved, we have meetings about it, we talk about it, we give our insight. Some brands accept it and some brands really push back. And this is what we got in response to this one. They said, regarding the all exhaust, based on our testing, the fan setup works the best. If we were to intake the fans, and now here's the thing, them saying they've tested this and they find it to be the best, okay, fine. We're talking factual numbers here, and it's hard to argue with facts, right? This is science. Science is not, I think it's influenced by opinion, but opinion doesn't hold weight in science, facts do. So all exhaust we know already is gonna be bad for dust buildup, first and foremost. Second of all, had they truly been testing it, I don't think those fan filters would have been left on there. Anyway, moving on. They said, and this is where they kind of lost me. We would be heating, if they sent them to intake, we would be heat dumping air from the radiators into the system. Now this is a comment I get a lot from people that watch the channel and are interested in about doing water cooling, and they are like, why are you using intakes on a rad? Aren't you just dumping heat into the system? Now I've been water cooling for over 25 years by using intakes on my front radiator or my side radiator or whatever, and have never ever had a problem. I would rather have fresh air coming through the rad than having warm air go out of the rad. Anyway, moving on. This would provide the most longevity to all the components in the system. And this is where the little antenna was like zzz, zzz on my head, right? A little droid antenna. Exhausting all hot air into the system would cause the internal components to heat up over time and would be prone to failure. And that's where they lost me with the complete BS meter just went off the chart. There is no freaking way enough heat could be built up in the loop to internally heat the chassis enough to kill a component or affect its lifespan. The amount of heat in the component itself is so much greater than any of the heat. Look, if there was enough heat built up to hurt your component, those hoses would have popped off long before that, because we've tested how much pressure can be held with a clamp before it pops off of one of these compression fittings and stuff. You would be melting the tubing before you would ever get to a component temperature issue. So today we're gonna use a few different temperature meters here. We are going to be doing some testing regarding components, and we are going to test the theory. We are gonna start with the control, which is the way they have it set up here. We will be testing outside temperatures, so we have an outside temp referenced to the chassis. We are gonna have an actual flow meter with a temperature gauge on it on top to measure the temperature of the air exiting the top of the, because that top radiator is the one that would be affected most, honestly, by intaking air and heating up air. So theoretically, if we're bringing air in through the back wall radiator, and it's heating up the components and heating up the inside, the top rad would notice it the most because all that air would be exhausting out the top. So we will be monitoring the top radiator temperature, and then we are also gonna have a probe just sitting in there monitoring the internal temperature of the chassis. Of course, we're gonna be running loops on Port Royal for the GPU. The GPU is the hottest component in there. This is gonna give us the biggest delta in temperatures. And we're gonna see whether or not flipping the fans around would improve the temperatures of both the components and the system as a whole. So let me show you how I plan on doing that. Okay, so this is the air. The air is exhausting out of here right now. So it's going out of here, out of here. I feel like at the very least, if they had added at least a 120 intake on the back, that would have added a little bit of positive pressure in there, or at least negated some of the negative pressure. Anyway, These are I forgot there were screws in there. I'll pick those up in a second. These are 28 millimeter Lee & Lee fans. No, they are not the same Corsair fans that are in there, but the reason why I chose these is I'm gonna be mounting these right here. And yeah, for those people that have been paying attention, you'll notice there obviously are 3 fans on that side. So I will be unplugging those 3 fans, which are plugged in. I'm not sure if it's these 3 or these 3, but it's one of these from the header. I will then be plugging this into the fan header and pushing air through from the outside. Now I chose the P28 fans for a couple of reasons. One, I've got to overcome the static pressure of those fans sitting there not turning, which is going to be additional restriction in airflow. But there shouldn't be enough to really truly hurt the scenario there. 2, these are adjustable speed fans. So they can go between 1300, 2200, or 2600. And I'll be running them on the medium setting, which is 2200, which is very similar to the Corsair fans that are in here when they're at full speed. And we will be doing A/B testing. So this will be closed, the fans will be mounted right there, and then we will compare before and after. So first thing we gotta do, warm up the system, get my temperature probe set up, see what it is before testing, let the loop run and run and run to get its max temperature, and see what the temperatures look like. Flip it around and see if I'm right. There's 3 outcomes that can come of this. I'm right, they're right, or we're both wrong. But Jay, how could you both be wrong? We would both be wrong by me saying the temperatures didn't get cooler, because ultimately I'm thinking the GPU will run cooler if we can have at least this radiator as an intake, getting fresher air going to it. We already showed in our review the air gets pretty hot. We also showed by bumping up the fan speeds, we were able to reduce the temperature quite a bit. Second, if the internal temperature doesn't rise, if it doesn't rise at all, we'll see, that would be a for sure I'm wrong, they're wrong. If it only rises a few degrees, they're clearly wrong, because a few degrees is not gonna kill your components. I would have to sit here with my blowtorch blowing hot air at it for quite a while before we ever see anything start to happen with these components. So that would be the scenario which we're both wrong. And then I'm wrong if, I guess, the temperatures don't change, because then they'd be right in saying that this was fine. Actually, I didn't say it was fine, I said it was best, but I don't have a way to measure best at the moment. Okay, so here's our setup. We've got I know there's glass, it's obviously hard to go or film through, but you can see our internal probe is sitting right there, just setting up in the center of the case. That's this guy right here. Here's our exhaust meter right here, which is just sitting right here on top. It's barely turning at the moment because the fans are really low, because right now the system's under idle. And then this is our ambient temperature probe, which is just sitting right here. Now these are best when touching something. Watch when I touch it. Look how fast that goes up. This is what we use with our LN2 pot stuff when we do our extreme overclocking. But the probe is still touching the air. So it'll take a second for it to cool down, because as you can see, I touched it and warmed it up, but it is cooling down, as you can see. So ambient temp, which is air entering the case, internal temperature is just measured in the center of the case, and then our exhaust temperature, as you can see, is the air exiting. Now I chose to use the top for the exhaust because that's not going to change. That's going to give us a pretty good indication of, have we affected our temperatures in a negative way by having air intaking through the rad, having the rad warm up that air and then exhaust out the top. Now, predictions. Right now, with a fully negative pressure system, I fully expect the internal temperature to stay fairly similar to where it is now. And the reason for that is because unless we have enough radiating heat coming off that 4090 and CPU and the other components that are in there, because they're gonna have heat generating, billowing away at some point, or radiating away, that shouldn't change a lot. Because as the fans ramp up, it should bring in fresh air, which should obviously allow this temperature to stay fairly, in fact, this might even come down slightly, because we'll have a little bit fresher air coming through there. But I wanna see now what's gonna happen with the exhaust for the most part, because as I've already said, and I need to reiterate this, sponsor or not, I wanna know now, is this true? And I've heard this a million times, and I've never had a problem ever, period, by running intake fans on a rad. So I'm gonna start the Port Royal. We're gonna let it loop and loop and loop and loop. So in terms of the fan curve, we decided to, locking off variables in any sort of scientific process is important. So I'm going to just go 100% on the fans. This will show us max cooling capability of the system. So yeah, we're gonna let it loop now. We'll leave it at 100%, which means those other fans will be going 100%, but at least I have the little built-in controller inline that I can change the RPM on those fans if I want to. I just need to make sure that the fan difference itself is not making up the difference. I don't think the fan design itself can make up the chassis design and the way it's laid out, but I have to be able to control for that. fact, we're gonna make a change before we start in case anyone caught this. This wire right here is far too close to the GPU, which will be putting off a lot of heat. We need to make sure, even though this is insulated, the heat of the GPU itself is not heating up this wire, which could give us a false result. So I'm just gonna sort of get this up here out of the way. There we go. The tubes themselves, trust me, are not gonna get warm enough for it to make any sort of difference. 22C ambient is what we're at right now for my Freedom Unit fans. That's 21.5 Fahrenheit in this
21?
room. I mean 71, wow. 71.3 Fahrenheit, that's Kelvin if you care. So there we go. And then the internal case temp, 73.7. So you can see we've got about a degree, and then almost 2 degrees, a degree and a half on the exhaust. So you can see, even with the system not under load, with the fans at 100%, there is warmth always being generated by the components. Speaking of warmth, it's time to create some. Let's go. Okay, so this has been running for probably about 25 minutes now, and you can see our ambient temp still pretty much the same, 71.3. The AC in here works really good. You can see our internal case temp, it measured right in the center of the case, is at 24.7 C, and our exhaust temp coming out of the top rad is 30.8. So we've got a delta between the exhaust and the ambient sitting at almost 10 C, so 9 C, right? 21.9 versus 30.8. So it's just about 9 C difference there, which, to be honest, is not that bad. Our component temperature, though, more importantly, is going between 51 and 53, depending on the part of the scene of Port Royal that's being rendered, with a hotspot of 60.4. If you guys remember, that's about 10 C down from where it was with the stock fan curves. And that's just because, I've said a million times, the fans don't ramp up with GPU when they're hooked up to the motherboard, which is why this build should have had them hooked up to their iCUE, which can use GPU. All right, so now what I need to do is I need to shut this down, and let's get this set up. Oh, one thing I want to point out too, the back panel was off on this particular test, but it won't make a difference, because if you take a look at it, again, this is exhausting, right? And I can feel the air right here. This is closed off. So I left it off for a fair A-B comparison because it has to be off when I attach these fans to the outside like that. Ideally, these would be on the inside and then the rad inside of that. But that's obviously not capable. I'm not able to do that because I'd have to completely tear this loop down to change these fans. I would have loved to have just taken these fans and flipped them around to keep it as controlled as possible, but I can't tear, I'm not tearing this loop down. Okay, so there we go. There is our, you know what, I don't need to close this door for any reasons, but I'm gonna go ahead and do it anyway, just so that we can keep things as close as possible. I've probably not gone through this much effort in a video in a while. Some might say it's because of ego, and I would say you're probably right. So one thing we noticed is the internal temp, as soon as we stopped the test, rose like crazy because all that radiant heat coming off the GPU and the radiators and all the components, the RAM, the CPU, was not being exhausted anymore. But with the intake fans right now, I want to point out those fans are pushing so much air, they're turning the blades. The fans are not on. Let me prove it. Hold on.
Wait, really?
Yeah, here, I'll unplug the fans. See? I just unplugged the intake fan, so that's how much air is being moved by those fans right there. So anyway, I'll plug these back in, and these are still set to medium, not high. So we'll come back with where the internal temp has decided to stop going down. So now that we've let the system cool down, the fans have been running for a bit, here's where our temperatures land. Our ambient has only been moving a couple of 0.2, maybe 0.2 at the most as the AC kicks on and off. It's very consistent in here in the temperatures, 70.5. I think 71 is where we would see it hit at the highest, like 71.5. Internal temperature right now under idle conditions is at 24 C, where before we had 23 C. So we're 1 C up, between 0.9 and 1 C. It keeps fluctuating right there. And then our exhaust temperature went from 24.1 to 24.4. So ironically, this internal temp went up almost a degree, but the exhaust temp only went up 0.4. Under idle conditions, we've already explained how they go up slightly. When we were sitting there prior, there's some heat going through the loop, even at idle. There's wattage that's being dissipated. Oh, it just went down, 0.3. Okay, back to 0.4, 0.3. So again, this is what we care about. The exhaust is the one we care about most. This is gonna tell us the big picture of, are we gonna heat our components to the point of premature failure or early failure or whatever, however they worded it. So our GPU is also idling at 24C. I wish I had gotten an idle temperature prior to putting the other fans on. But anyway, here we go. Let's run Port Royal again on a loop so that we can make sure, we'll see what our max temps end up at. Predictions, I think the internal is gonna climb a bit, but I don't think the exhaust is gonna climb as much as the internal is gonna climb, which still scientifically kind of blows my mind, but I guess we'll see. Well, I love when I get to prove myself right. No, and that sounds very egotistical. This is science, it's just, okay. So our ambient temp right now is actually up slightly from where it was on the base temps before. That's only because it's now 100 and something degrees outside. So our AC is up about 1 degree Fahrenheit, which is showing a little bit here. But just so if you guys are seeing the difference here, that's why. Our internal temperatures under load before were 24.7, and Phil will be putting this on the screen. We're at 28.8, so we are 4 degrees Celsius up on the internal temperature. Now that makes perfect sense because we are bringing heat in, but remember, we are bringing cooler air through the radiator now. So with our 4 degrees up internal, what will we see on the radiator? Well, we went from 30.8 to 30.9. Our component temp under load before maxed, we had 52C and a 53C peak. We were at 48C and a 49C peak, and it spends more time at 47. Look, it just dropped to 45. The end of the test is harder than the start of the test. So we're at 45 and then 48. Our hotspot went from 61.8 to 55 and a max of 58.1, where the max before was a 62.4. So we're down like anywhere between 3 to 5C by just, and remember, I'm still turning those fans with the other fans. If those fans weren't there, it would be probably probably 2C, maybe 3 even lower, because there's a lot of restriction that those fans are having to overcome. I am not doing my test any favors by having those fans on there. But here's the other thing, check this out. I was not expecting this. Our maximum RAM temperature was 58C. We are at 52C on the RAM now. So if we go back to the email in question here, that says, exhausting all the hot air into the system would cause the internal components to heat up over time and will be prone to failure over time. What I've actually proved is through lower temperatures, we have extended the life of our components. Now there's only one thing I can think here, is that they misunderstood when I said these fans should be exhausting or intaking, where they took it as all the fans should be intaking. Now here's the thing. I just showed you by turning one set of fans around what happened to our component temps. If I wanted to go a step farther, I would take 3 more of those fans, put them on top as intake, and see what happens with all 6 as intake. So by changing it like we did, we have 0 change in component temperature. We're still 47 to 49, depending on the part of the test. The hotspot is still 58.3, right there it was. Memory is still at 52, currently at 50. I didn't even see what that was before. I want to point out, my fans are still blowing through fans that are not plugged in, having to spend energy turning them. But this is the internal temperature. So this one means nothing, because this is just pulling in air from the top, right? So I'm kind of surprised it's a 1.2C or 1.3C higher than ambient, but whatever. There's still some radiating heat probably coming through that. I don't know. Some of that air is probably splashing around and going in a loop, whatever. So this is no longer important. Do you think 30C is enough to kill your components and cause early failure? No. This is just what some BS that people say when they're trying to defend a position. I would have highly respected had they just said, we think this is prettier. Because at the end of the day, the difference in temperature, although 4C roughly is noticeable, it's not detrimental. We're still so much cooler than if we were running air cooling. You know, obviously this is better for the CPU no matter what the fan configuration is here. My recommendation is still to have intakes and exhausts, whether there's a radiator there or not. So you can see now the radiator is not dumping enough heat in here to cause a problem. It's just simply not. And as soon as I stop this test, you're gonna see the temp start to drop fairly quickly because of the fact that you have the fresh air still at 100% fan speed right now, cooling stuff down as cooling down the liquid. So it's gonna take time for the liquid to release that heat every pass that goes through the rads, it lets go of a little bit of heat. But look how fast the temperature internal is starting to drop. So what you're seeing right here is the temperature coming through the top rad. And now because you have 2 rads that are being cooled by outside air, that starts to drop. But I wouldn't recommend all intakes. I mean, in terms of just noise and pressure and all that wouldn't, you now are relying on positive pressure to push all the air out. I'm a balanced airflow guy. If I got 3 fans bringing air in, I want 3 fans bringing air out. If I've got 3 fans bringing air in through a radiator and restriction, I want to balance my exhaust airflow so I'm not in a negative pressure situation. I want a neutral pressure or slightly positive. That is what I've always preached. But the whole reason I made this video was you can't tell someone that has been water cooling for over 25 years that by having a radiator bring air through it into the case is going to reduce the longevity of your components, because that is what sent the BS meter antenna into the roof, and that is what's made this entire video happen. But science, stuff, results, you guys can decide for yourself. Also too, the only other thing that we really were missing here that would have made this even more scientific would be fluid temperature, but there's no fluid temperature probe inside this loop, because the fluid temperature ultimately is what is affecting all of the inside temperatures of your components and your case and all that. There you go. Do with this information as you will, but no, by having, whether it's an AIO or a custom loop, having an intake through a rad is not going to hurt your system. And what I proved is you get better temps out of it. All right guys, thanks for watching. And as always, all you had to do was say you thought it was prettier this way and I would have respected that. Don't BS a BSer. Although I don't BS you guys. Not intentionally.